that's why representation is so important and why it's not just a box to tick or a nice to have. It's actually quite essential to people's well-being to see themselves reflected in stories. And I think that absence is part of the reason why I've worked so hard to become a storyteller. It's the kind of story that I needed when I was younger, the kind of story that would have meant a lot to me. And I can't go back and give it to my younger self, but I can give it to the teenagers of now. My life is my advocacy. The greatest act I can do as an advocate, it turns out, is just continue to live my life and make myself as visible as possible, and also try to experience as much joy as possible.
Welcome to the podcast, Hannah Diviney.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be your first interview. Yay!
I'm so glad you're my first deep dive too. Now, Hannah, you and I have known each other for a long time. I know you to be an actor, an author, screenwriter, disability advocate, and media personality who's never afraid to call out the big names and the big systems. You gained huge international attention for a petition demanding Disney create its first princess with a disability, and for calling out ableist lyrics in songs by Lizzo and Beyonce. Your debut essay collection, I'll Let Myself In, is out there in the world now. It was published in 2023. And you also were named Advocate of the Year at the Marie Claire 2023 Women of the Year Awards. As an actor, you made Australian TV history in the SBS Digital Originals Latecomers as the first disabled person to appear in a sex scene on Australian TV. You also made your feature film debut at South by Southwest with the film Audrey, and you're developing your own slate of projects that puts romance and representation front and centre. You're known for speaking up in these big pop culture moments, launching that petition with Disney, campaigning against Lizzo and Beyonce's ableist lyrics, and seeing real change happen. Can you tell us a bit about those moments and what drives you to step into them rather than just letting them pass you by?
So I guess for context, I should start by telling everybody that the physical disability that I have is called cerebral palsy, which means I navigate the world in a wheelchair. Cerebral palsy is something that affects my gross and fine motor skills. So in non-scientific English, that means it affects everything from my ability to get out of bed, standing, walking, balancing, getting dressed on my own, going to the bathroom independently, all that kind of big stuff. But it's also small things like being able to use cutlery properly, handwriting neatly, or being able to play a musical instrument, for example. So that's sort of the context in which I exist as a disabled person. Those campaigns are very much driven by a lack of representation for me as a kid growing up. Like, I never saw anyone who looked like me in the films that I watched, in the TV shows, in the books I read, in the games I played, in the toys available on the shelves. It was all very much about an able-bodied narrative. And from the point of view of Lizzo and Beyonce, that was more about seizing an opportunity to educate people, because the particular slur that they used, spaz, which is short for spastic, is a kind of cultural shorthand for losing control or bad behavior or that sort of thing. But in relation to my cerebral palsy specifically, the full name of my condition is actually spastic diplegic cerebral palsy, where spastic in that context refers to spasticity, or otherwise kind of an unending tightness that is constantly kind of triggered by and in my muscles. So even now, while we're talking to each other, I can kind of feel everything thrumming with tension. I often joke that my hamstrings are so tight you could probably shoot a bow off them, pretty much. So that was the context behind which I kind of took exception to that language. But I think if we go back for a minute, I'm just very aware that the lack of representation has sort of left a crater behind in terms of my self-worth. And through a lot of like work in therapy and through writing and all of that stuff, I've sort of discovered that it raises all of these questions about where people like me were and are, why we weren't seen and why we aren't seen. And then if we go further than that and a little bit deeper than that, and this is hard to say to someone who knows me so well, you start to wonder, like, whether you deserve to kind of exist, whether there's worth in you being around, which of course there is, but that's why representation is so important and why it's not just a box to tick or a nice to have. It's actually quite essential to people's well-being to see themselves reflected in stories. And I think that absence is part of the reason why I've worked so hard to become a storyteller. It's definitely why I started the Disney Princess petition. Now, at the time, I was just sort of an audacious writer and advocate. I didn't have any connections to the film and television industry. I was kind of trying to figure out how to break in, but I have to be honest that because of the lack of representation that was available to me, that sort of dissuaded me from pursuing a career in this industry. And then Latecomers happened by accident, and I found myself here. In terms of the specificity of asking for a Disney princess, I'm very aware that those are the characters that uphold the legacy, aside from Mickey Mouse. They are the ones that appear on the bedspreads and the merchandise and that children dress up as for birthday parties and for Halloween, and there are toys and books and so much paraphernalia. The impact of that kind of character existing in a physically disabled form would be profound. Specifically in the Lizzo situation, because that happened first, that was mainly driven by my feeling as a music and pop culture fan that Lizzo using that language didn't really gel with my idea of who I thought she was and the sort of brand of inclusion and self-love and all of that stuff that her music was built on at the time. But I had also had the experience as a kid of that word being weaponized against me and others. So I tweeted about it. It took me 30 seconds. To be completely honest, I didn't really have an outcome in mind. I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that this probably wasn't okay in 2022. And then I went back to what I was doing. A couple of hours later, I picked up my phone and I looked down and my screen was just a mass of blue notifications that were rapidly replacing themselves with each other. So a couple of days later, I got a text from a friend in all caps that just said, "She's changing the lyric, head to her Instagram." And I remember seeing this beautifully written permanent post and statement on her Instagram that was so generous and so kind and very much framed as I'd hoped in the context of she knew what it was like as a woman of color and as a plus-size woman to have words weaponized against her, and she was very gracious in saying that she didn't do that intentionally. So she re-recorded the song and changed the lyrics. And then 6 weeks after that, Beyonce used the same slur. And I'll be honest, I was reluctant to call out Beyonce because her fan base is so intensely passionate. I had to really take a deep breath and sort of just decide that the cause and the conversation that I was potentially going to be having and the potential for educating people and creating awareness was far more important. Part of the reason why I'm so unafraid to take on big systems and just sort of ask for what I want in this very clear and direct way is because I have nothing to lose.
Hmm.
I know what people think of disabled people, generally speaking, in society still in 2026. So I think if I operate from the place of, well, if nothing happens, or if they say no, or if this goes pear-shaped, then it's not really any worse than it would be if I'd said nothing. The opportunity for it to work and the potential of what will happen kind of in terms of outer ripples, if my advocacy works, or if my storytelling reaches the right people, far outweighs the risk I take when I actually ask.
You wrote a piece for Mamma Mia recently. You were referencing Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, and there's a quote within it. I'm not remembering the exact lines, but something about to you, I'm a monster, I'm not seen, but to myself I simply am. And it really struck me, you quoting that and thinking about what you're saying about representation now, that when disabled people don't see themselves on screen, it's not simply an absence, it's a world telling them that they don't exist as full, complex, incredible human beings such as yourself.
Yeah, that's how it feels. And suddenly people kind of understand a lot more because they have both a visual and like a character reference for the emotion that you're feeling. So inadvertently, I'm very grateful to Frankenstein because it's helped me a lot in terms of representation conversations. I spend a lot of time in my work at the moment thinking about bodies and how we perceive people and the different expectations that we place on people because of who we assume them to be because of their body. And Frankenstein is a great example of how to unpack that and think it through.
Do you see your advocacy work and storytelling as inherently linked? Are they things that actually feed each other?
I think they're inherently linked. I used to think of advocacy as a very separate part of me, and there are some ways in which it's still a job. But I've also discovered, by virtue of doing things like Latecomers and Audrey, or the latest season of The 12, or even just sort of existing in public spaces and getting to do media appearances like this, that my life is my advocacy. The greatest act I can do as an advocate, it turns out, is just continue to live my life and make myself as visible as possible, and also try to experience as much joy as possible, because I think, and this doesn't just apply to disabled or marginalized people, but especially in the world right now, in the position that we're in, joy is one of the greatest forms of resistance we have, because people in power and with control would probably prefer us to be miserable and feeling helpless, because then they continue to run away unchecked and have all the power. Now more than ever, storytelling is more important because it's how we escape, but it's also how we survive.
You've launched a social media campaign trying to reconnect with Jacob Elordi after a very brief real-life encounter with him at an event. Can you tell us what happened in those amazing 30 seconds?
So I was lucky enough to be invited to the Sydney Wuthering Heights premiere, and I had been talking to people about ways that I might be able to put myself in front of both Jacob Elordi and Margot Robbie, just because I think they are incredible humans and creatives, and I would love to be connected with them in some way in the future. So I was kind of trying to plant some seeds, as I tend to do. And I ended up being at the very front of the red carpet where they walked in. So Margot walked in first, and she was one of the most ethereal human beings I think I have ever seen in my life. When they cast her as Barbie, they really weren't kidding. It's like, whoa. And she was so lovely. She like directly thanked me for coming, and I was like, "You're welcome." Like my internal monologue basically being like, "I would go anywhere you wanted me to go." And then Jacob walked past. The sound when Jacob got out of the car was indescribable. The amount of girls were lined up over the other side of the street, screaming their hearts out, crying, trying to get his attention. It was a lot. And he walked past, pretty much had completely finished walking past me, turned around, looked me directly in the eye and said, "You look beautiful." And I was pretty taken aback because, one, it's Jacob Elordi, and two, I'm very aware that, like, people don't have to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that he made an effort when he was very clearly, like, trying to be rushed to another spot meant a lot to me. And also, like, in the context of being a disabled woman, beautiful is not really a word I get to hear too much.
Mm-hmm.
So it meant a lot.
For those of you who haven't seen the video, we'll put a link in the podcast episode notes. It's a POV video, and Jacob does a U-turn. So almost passes Hannah, does a U-turn, points, and says, "You're beautiful." And because it's POV, I swear anybody watching that is just melting on the other side of that video, because it looks like he's saying that to everybody watching that video.
I have to say, when I got to actually speak with him a couple of minutes later, I mean, everyone knows how tall Jacob Elordi is. Well, you think you know how tall he is, and then you see him in real life, and he's like a decent head above everybody else. So for me, sitting down, I'm like this, like, hi, trying to talk. And without me asking, just kind of immediately, he got down on my level and made it so that we could converse eye to eye. And he typically wears sunglasses on the red carpet, I would imagine, to protect his eyes from the incessant flashing of cameras, because that would drive you mad. He made sure to, like, take off his sunglasses, get down on my level. It was very quick, obviously, because he was trying to be in 1,001 places, and then they didn't stay for the screening. But if I had more of an opportunity to speak with him, I actually would have mentioned all of that stuff we talked about earlier, about the creature and about Frankenstein and about what that means for me as a physically disabled human. All of the footage that I got and the way that I posted and kind of told the story went viral, to the point where, because Jacob made the effort to interact with me, more people than ever have become invested in my work, in my writing. They've decided they want to follow me. They've decided they want to invest in my voice. And typically, if that has happened in the past, it's been quite easy to thank the person who has done that for me, whether they've done it intentionally or inadvertently by just sharing a very human moment with me. Normally I would, send them a DM or an email, or I might be able to text them, depending on who it is and how things are connected. But obviously with Jacob, things are a little bit further out of reach than the average. I have reached out to his team, and I have reached out to Lucky Chap as well, but I haven't heard anything yet.
Touching on Wuthering Heights, it's one of the greatest love stories in literature, in film. What people might not know about you is that it's inspired you to write a project of your own in that romance genre. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so as it happens, I've actually been playing with the idea of writing my own romantic project probably since I was in Latecomers, because I have to be completely honest, and this kind of level of candidness is a little strange, but until Latecomers, I had sort of locked all of those thoughts and feelings about the possibility of romance in a box and not let myself touch it or think about it. And then obviously, by virtue of the fact that we were telling a love story on screen, and we were telling it in a highly intimate and detailed and quite confronting way for an audience, in terms of the fact that it took until 2022 for them to see a disabled person have sex on screen in this country, that box sort of burst open. And I was like, okay, so what am I going to do with all of these thoughts and feelings and questions that I am now starting to ask myself about the future? And typically what happens when I am asking myself things like that, it tends to show up in the writing that I do and in the stories that I want to tell. And in particular, from being around kind of the industry and sort of watching the mechanics of how certain things come to life, I'm interested in an interabled relationship. So in this case, where the female lead is disabled, so hopefully that would be played by me, and the male lead is able-bodied. And in this context of the story, they're going to be two actors who have to fall in love for a movie, and then off screen things get kind of complicated, because I'm just fascinated by all of the different ways that actors have to put themselves through different things to an extent in order to achieve a good performance.
Romance films tend to sort of follow a pretty familiar format. A couple meets, falls in love, conflict, resolution. But when you're putting a disabled person into that romantic lead, as you're intending to do with your feature film, how does that shape desire and obstacles, character growth? Is it more than simply a casting choice? But how does it feed into story?
I think it is definitely more than a casting choice, because in the case of this particular character that I'm sort of working on building at the moment, there are external reasons why this couple will struggle to be together, but there's also a lot of internal stuff. And it's sort of my kind of railing against the idea that seems to have been popularized in culture, that in order to be loved by someone, you have to love yourself first. Because while I think self-love and self-worth are important, and the whole of them should never be tied up in another person, I, speaking from experience, know that if somebody were to love you, or were to love someone who looks like me, let's say, that would go a long way towards kind of fixing, or at least diluting, the wounds left by that lack of representation that we were talking about earlier. Because I think what I'm going to do is kind of carry all of those feelings and experiences into this character, in that she is going to be the sort of person who, when this particular job is over, there will be a lot of uncertainty for her around if and when she'll get to act again. There's all sorts of reasons why I want to make her disabled, but I think in part it's just because it's the kind of story that I needed when I was younger, the kind of story that would have meant a lot to me. And I can't go back and give it to my younger self, but I can give it to the teenagers of now. And I can also give it to able-bodied audiences who will hopefully end up confronting a lot of their both conscious and unconscious biases, and sort of really start to understand that although a person might be disabled, they are still a full human, which is kind of in parallel with the fact that although a person might be famous and have access to wealth and privilege, they are also still a full human.
Why hasn't it happened yet? We're looking at an awareness in the industry that disabled people are critically underrepresented on screen, especially in Australia. And yet it doesn't seem to go beyond that awareness. So what is getting in the way, do you think?
If we look at the industry as a whole at the moment, it's fairly risk averse. We don't seem to be collectively greenlighting stories that might make audiences uncomfortable. There's also just a lack of investment by the industry at large in the sorts of people who would be predisposed to tell those stories. Like, if we're going to limit certain stories to being told by lived experience, which is the way to do it without causing harm to communities, then the only way to fix that, or to change that, or to see those numbers improve, is to invest in the people who actually do have the lived experience and can tell those stories. I just think it's important that we start looking around at all the voices who might be missing. And I would challenge, in like the kind of gentlest terms possible, any established voices who might be listening to this, who know that, say, their name is the thing that's going to get a project greenlit, whether you're coming at it from a production standpoint or you're an actor or a writer whose name immediately carries weight. Do what you can to open the door for other people. Put your name or your support behind someone who has a project that might not have that access to the sort of gilded rooms yet. You also have to be willing to tell stories or be faced with stories that are going to make you uncomfortable.
And be willing to advocate for those stories. Because if those gatekeepers are keeping those gilded rooms under tight lock and key, and if that model doesn't shift anytime soon, if those gatekeepers aren't changing anytime soon, then I think that's a really interesting point you're making, that it is reliant on people who have that ready access to open those doors, but to keep advocating for those stories to be told. But it takes that advocacy all the
It
way,
has to
right?
be genuine investment and advocacy, and it means using your platform that you've created to put the story above all else. The thing that you hear actors say all the time is, "Oh, I love storytelling." And I always go, "Yeah, I do too, but what stories are you helping to tell? Are you just telling the ones that your agent puts on your desk, or are you trying to work out ways that you can use the power you have accrued and accumulated over time to help other stories be told?" Because I guarantee there are hundreds, if not thousands, of stories that you haven't even thought of telling yet that just need the space and the room and the advocate in their corner.
Let's go back to Latecomers. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's on SBS. It's a digital original series about two people with cerebral palsy whose care workers hook up one night, and that springboards them onto their own exploration of relationship and sex. It really turns up the dial on representation. It doesn't just push for visibility, but it goes into something really interesting and much deeper. And it looks at desirability, which is such a fascinating space I'd love to talk to you about. How did that shape how you think about who gets to be seen as desirable on screen?
It turned it on its head, and it meant a lot of very visceral kind of unpacking and sort of confrontation of my own ideas. Because I think, to be quite honest, up until that point, I hadn't really ever felt desirable. And it wasn't until people who have no kind of obligation or connection to me in that, like, they're not my family, started to say, actually, that scene was like really important, or like it was quite hot, or just different versions of that comment, that I started to go, oh, oh, okay, so what does that mean now? And what does that mean in terms of what I think of myself, and how that all kind of connects together? And I'll be honest, I'm still doing a lot of catching up, but I think that's why a project of a feature length that really looks at the fact that part of the kind of success of romance as a genre is whether two people in a film can be found desirable by an audience, is sort of the natural extension of that way of thinking. With that in mind, I am very clear, at least in my vision for the film, that whoever the male lead ends up being, they need to be someone for whom making the decision, at least as a character, to choose someone who looks like me when they look like they do is a statement in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the only way we're going to move the conversation forward. And that's going to really sort of put the cat amongst the pigeons, so to speak, and really force people to think about it in ways that they maybe haven't before.
I was involved in Latecomers, so I have an intimate knowledge of why that project worked, how the door opened for that project, but also how that desirability was celebrated. And in fact, I can recall a conversation with one of the producers about that scene, that sex scene. I think they'd had some notes from other people that it felt like it went too far. And my note is no, the note is it didn't go far enough. You can't hold back because you have a disabled lead. In fact, you just have to let it be the beautiful sort of sexy moment that it wanted to be.
The version that we shot was actually a little bit more explicit than the version that the audience ended up seeing. And the reason why we shot the most explicit version we could is because we all collectively made the decision together that if we're going to do this, and people have been waiting until 2022 for this kind of history to be made, then we're going to do it right. Our wonderful director, Madeline Gottlieb, and our intimacy coordinator, Carolyn Casper, were quite aware that I'd never acted before and that this role was going to be asking a lot of me. So they did check in with me several times about, like, are you sure you want to go this far? And I was like, well, yeah, we're not just going to imply that these people are having sex or that these characters are finding pleasure. We are going to make people watch because they need to see it. And it's not just a disabled audience that needs to see it. It's an able-bodied audience too, and it needs to be as intense as we can possibly make it, because we might only get one shot at this, and if we only get one shot, then at least we've contributed this to the kind of cinematic and television canon of storytelling.
With your project, what do you need, Hannah? If there aren't as many doors as you want opening naturally, what do you need?
Well, aside from the perennial funding question and, like, support from people, I should also say that if you haven't figured it out by now, I'm the kind of person who decides that if we're going to do something like this and it's going to be invested in, it needs to make the biggest splash it possibly can. I am definitely not aiming for this to be a niche film that only a handful of people see. I want this to be the kind of thing that is leading to packed cinemas around the world. And to be quite honest, in terms of, like, a production partner, there is probably no one I could think of better other than Mad Ones Films, who did Latecomers with us, than Lucky Chap Productions. So if anyone who is kind of involved in that part of the world or has any ideas around how to sort of get people to invest in this story, both financially and emotionally, I'd be more than happy for any advice, connections, all of that kind of thing. But yeah, in terms of what I need, I would definitely love some development money to write the script. That would be ideal, I think.
Okay, funders, okay, agencies.
I have to be honest, telling such a personal story, the idea of doing that, getting all the way to the end of the screenplay, basically putting my heart on a plate and it not working or it not going anywhere is terrifying. But it also means I'm going to probably be an absolute menace about this, because it's definitely not going to sit in a file on my laptop. And I do have some ideas about who I would like my romantic lead to possibly be and how the story would work. I can think of quite a few suitable candidates, in fact. But once again, if anyone has any connections or if anyone wants to be brave and take that risk with me, because I know that this story is a risk, and I know that distributors and all of those people and people involved in marketing films and all of that will be hearing this going, this isn't going to work. but I promise you it is. I promise you there's a market for it.
I think the reason I believe that you're going to make this happen connects to what you were saying about latecomers, connects to what you were saying about being audacious and being a menace, is that you're not going to do this politely. So you're not going to cater for a safe version of what you think audiences might be able to tolerate. You're going to push them into that place of
Yeah.
discomfort. And it makes me think back to moments in latecomers, even as the commissioner, knowing the story, knowing that world inside and out, that when I watched the final cut, put me into a place of discomfort. I loved it because I loved understanding where I needed to be challenged. So I loved that about the story. And when we're sitting in that place of discomfort, that's where we grow as human beings, right? So I have no doubt, Hannah Diviney, that you're going to make this happen.
I have so many other stories to tell as well. Like I do want to be clear that as a disabled creative, disabled stories are not the only form of story I can tell.
I don't think it matters what you're asking Hannah to do within the industry. Hannah's got it covered.
My walking skills are a little questionable, but other than that, pretty much anything.
Now, Hannah, we ask all our podcast guests the same question to end the episode. And that is, what is your big idea to shape the future of our industry? Did you have a big idea, Hannah?
I was reflecting on this really rare experience I had after I shot this film called Audrey. And for a number of reasons, it happened to be that Screen Australia ended up coming to my house. And they kind of sat me down and they just wanted to kind of check in and see how the experience was and all of that sort of stuff. But as a consequence of that, when they found out I was a writer, they also basically just said, "What ideas have you got?" And I went, "Oh, okay, great." So I think what we need to do, you know how they have football scouts and stuff like that for sports teams, and there are scouts that will go to like far off communities or communities that are very removed from the like mecca of sport. And I was thinking it would be really cool if we could somehow turn that concept into like scouts for story and scouts for like production skills. I mean, we do have it a little bit on the acting side, and the agents will go to like drama showcases and things like that. But just really trying to meet people where they're at and trying to ask questions about who's getting to tell stories. And like I said, challenging the people who are well established at it, the names who immediately get a project up, to really start using their power for good, allowing people to have ideas without worrying them about the process of making the idea. Insofar as, like, don't get me wrong, it's incredibly important that someone knows that making a film or a TV show is a hard process, is a long process. But something I was struck by when I kind of inadvertently spent the last sort of Actors Festival pitching my film idea is that while a lot of people were encouraging, there was also a really interesting undertone of, that's great, but feature films don't get made. As realistic and as pragmatic as that may be, that's not the thing you want to say to an emerging creative. We have to create a space where people are allowed to present their wildest, most expressive stories. The question then becomes, like, after you've heard the story and given it time to develop, how do we make this? How are we going to make this happen? Not can we make this, not should we make this, not I don't really think audiences will like it if we make this, but how can we make this happen?
And that's the risk aversion you were talking about earlier, when people are looking for their out. So they're looking for the out in story and not looking at it as the opportunity, which it inarguably is. You and I both know that. If we're going to put a call out to industry to say we need these new stories, don't expect that they're just going to walk in the door. That's a right of privilege to know where that door is in the first place. So if we're going to genuinely put that call out for stories, we have to be meeting people where they're at. We have to be going out into communities to find those stories. I mean, I would love that job, the scout for untold stories. Out of this podcast episode, we're going to get your feature film up, Hannah. We're going to find me a new career path as a scout for untold stories. And we're going to get Jacob more than 30 seconds of time with you. And out of that, I think the whole world is going to change. Hannah Diviney, it's been such a delight. As always, my dear, dear friend, I'm so, so proud of everything that you've achieved. I hope that the industry at large continues to support voices like you because we really need them. Thank you for joining us on We Interrupt this broadcast.
Thank you for having me.
We Interrupt this broadcast is recorded on the unceded lands of the
Gadigal people of the Eora Nation,
the Turrbal and Yagara people,
the Yugambeh language people,
and the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and we acknowledge them as the traditional custodians and first storytellers of these regions.
always was, always will be.